So good evening, my small group here. Welcome to our book club. Again, Mary, I see you online. Ask questions when you want to, Mary. So welcome to our book club. We're gonna get started with Bud Bailey talking about his book on the Buffalo Bills. So
and any other book you want to talk about.
And any other book.
I've written 15, so.
Oh, wow, yeah.
That's great.
So, yeah.
Well, Bud, I'm going to personally welcome you here today. You see, I had to wear my colors today, just for that. So
You could have worn the Buffalo Braves t-shirt.
I know, and I actually thought about that, but I'm like, no, this is Bill's time. It's dedicated Bill's time, and it's such an exciting time too, for the city and everything going on. And one thing I want to mention about the book is what I really liked about it is that it really, I think a lot of people who read this are going to read things that really is going to bring a lot of pride to everybody about the city, about the team. And I was just so interested in some of like the unique things that we have here that they may not have, in other places. And so if you haven't read it yet, I know anybody who likes Buffalo Bills is going to love it. So anyway, Britt, I'm going to start out with a question for you. How long did it take you to do this book?
Not as long as you'd think, is the short answer. It's funny, I was in the press box of the Bison's game. I'm the pitch clock timer at some Bison games. The phone rang and it was a guy from Reedy Press in St. Louis who said, we do a series of books on NFL teams' histories and you were recommended to do a Bills book. And I'm like, that's interesting. And the funny part was I had one book that I just finished the manuscript of on Cleveland sports history and another book on the Buffalo Braves basketball team, which we were winding down. So I said, well, I'd be interested if you can wait till I get the Braves book done on November 1st. Now, all this led to the fact that I had 3 books at once come out in the fall of 2023, which is insanity.
Yeah.
Sure, don't try this at home, kids. So they called up and I called up Greg Tranter, who I had worked with the Braves book. And Greg is, I don't know if he's the Bills' #1 fan, but he's the #1 collector. He's got the largest collection of Bills memorabilia, which he donated to the History Museum at some point. And he's got virtually every program the team's ever produced, ticket stubs going back to 1960. Even silly things, like I had a Marine Midland towel from 1971 that had the Bills logo on it. And I said, Greg, would you be interested in this? Because I don't really need it. He said, I've got 4. Who has 4 Marine Midland Bills towels? So, but he was more enthusiastic than I was, if anything, because he's a season ticket holder who lives in Massachusetts and drives in for virtually every home game.
Wow, that's awesome.
So, and driving in sometimes can be less than fun, as you may have noticed lately, especially in Orchard Park. So we started working on the Braves book and the Bills book together for a while. The Bills book got done in November. And it was a funny writing project because we knew how many pages there were. We didn't know what was going to go on those pages because the Bills were in the midst of a playoff run.
Mm-hmm.
So if the Bills had won the Super Bowl, it would have taken up space. We would have needed pictures of the Super Bowl and the other playoff games. We needed parade pictures and stuff like that. So it was almost like an accordion where we wrote extra stories. And then when we finally knew the Bills' fate was sealed, we could say, all right, now we know what we got to work with and we can start throwing things out and leaving things in. So it was a very odd process in that sense that we just didn't know what was going to be in until the Bills lost to the Bengals in the playoff game that particular year. Wow. But that loss took place in January and then the book was out in July. So, and as Greg says, we're both students enough of the Bills' history at this point that it's almost like the only research we need is to say, was it an 18-yard scoring run or a 21-yard scoring run? We knew what most of the items were. We went through like 60 or 70 items and we said, well, that's got to be in, that's got to be in. And then we had a few that we argued a little bit. It's like, all right, I'll give you that if you'll give me this. Okay. It took about an hour to hash that out. So, And the writing was quite simple. We'd go back and forth and would make suggestions. It's like, all right, let's see, find a couple more quotes there or whatever. But it was really a breeze just because the history is so much a part of the team's heritage in Western New York. It comes up a lot. It's a close-knit town. The relationship between the Bills and the town is unique just because it's a small city. It's not like Green Bay, but Green Bay is one of the closest things to it in terms of population. It's not like New York City where an NFL team can almost get lost, especially if you're the Jets or Giants lately. Nobody wants to talk about those guys lately. But the Bills are Buffalo's chance to play with the big boys and to compete with the New Yorks and Chicago's, Los Angeles, and on an equal basis. And lately it's been an unequal basis because the Bills have been better than most of those teams. So there's a lot of civic pride that comes with a football team that does well on the national scale. And you've seen it over the last few years since the Bills finally ended their playoff drought and have gotten good.
Yeah. Well, how did you select? I mean, because there's a ton of stories in here, but I'm sure there's probably like hundreds more. But did you have any kind of like well, I know it's a timeline, but were there anything like specific that you were looking for or wanted to highlight when people would read the book, what they would maybe take away from those stories?
But mostly they're pretty obvious. They're the big games. I mean, you almost start with the playoff games throughout the years, and that's X number of pages. You start with the big regular season games. There are moments that come up where you just say, well, that has to be in the book. For example, the Bills had lost to the Dolphins in 20 straight games. Through this, the Bills were 0 for the 70s. So the Bills played the Dolphins in 1980 and beat them, and the fans came down and tore down the goalposts, which
each end.
Both ends. They just took it over, and you say, okay, that's in. And so there's a certain amount of things that just have to go in. And once you get done with that, then you're saying like, well, are there, what sort of trades were there? For example, like the O.J. Simpson trade was pretty significant, but we wound up running out of space. So we rolled that O.J. item into another story on O.J. when he set the single season rushing record on Thanksgiving Day against the Lions in 1976. So there's little tricks like that so that most of the important points are mattered. And it's a good sized book. So you're kind of splitting hairs. We didn't really overlook anything big, and you can argue all day about what might be number 76 versus 77 and what might go in and what isn't. So it wasn't too difficult.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, because I really did like the selection. I really like another thing that I really like about the book is that it's for everybody. This is a book for everybody, no matter how old you are. Because, I go back, I remember watching my first football game. That was the first Super Bowl. That was the first time that we gathered as a family to watch a game, because no one in my family was really interested in football at the time. My brother was a little bit, but my dad he was a baseball guy. But then my sister, she started dating a guy who liked football. So all of a sudden now we have football in our lives. So, and I really enjoyed reading. Like there's stuff in here that I had absolutely no idea. One of the stories that really sticks with me though, and maybe can relate it to everybody, is about the boycott in 1965 of the All-Star game.
Yes.
It blew me away. I'm never going to forget that.
The AFL All-Star game was in New Orleans in 1965, and several Bills were picked for that team. Some African-American, some white, and they went down there, and New Orleans was segregated, and the African-Americans could not stay in the same hotel as their teammates. So there were also incidences of Black players not being picked up by white taxi cab drivers in New Orleans. The players got together and said, this is intolerable. And to his everlasting credit, Jack Kemp was on that team and said, what do you need me to do, guys? And they wound up moving the game out of New Orleans to Houston and played the game in an unsegregated stadium as opposed to the one back in New Orleans. And the game came on. Al Davis, the Raiders owner, had even offered to host the game on short notice in Oakland, but they wound up playing in Houston, and it really was a milestone for all concerned. without getting too detailed for anyone's pleasure. New Orleans wanted an NFL franchise, and it really needed to show that this sort of event would not happen. So as soon as that AFL All-Star game was over, the politicians realized it was in their best financial interest to be much more welcoming to the African-American community, especially in terms of sports. They rewrote the regulations about segregated stadiums, and Louisiana had some very powerful people in Congress, so that when the AFL-NFL merger was written in 1966, the price that the Louisiana legislators asked to get the legislation through to the president was an NFL franchise. So they said, you change your regulations and you get a franchise. And that's how the New Orleans Saints were born.
Wow. I think it's just such a great story. It really is. I'd like to open it up. Does anybody have any questions, or, something you want to share?
When you approach did the Bills have any influence on what to pick or what not to?
Not a word. They wouldn't even sell it in their gift store.
Really?
Because it wasn't a Bills product. Believe me, if there had been a way,
Oh, yeah.
we would have been
sure.
happy to,
Yeah.
but they did not.
So there was no pressure to minimize the OJ or to put in something that they wanted.
Funny you mention that, because the publisher actually wanted us to downplay OJ's contribution. And if you'll notice, OJ's the name Simpson is in none of the headlines of individual stories. They didn't want him to see that much publicity. They were very sensitive about that. So it's one of those little arguments that you lose.
Yeah.
Like the title.
Yeah, but I like the way you handled it too, because it is part of Buffalo Bills history, and he was a great player. You cannot, no matter what, you can't really take that away from him. So I really did appreciate how he was, it's because some places they would just completely, eliminate him. But, there's enough information about him, because it was a very exciting time in Buffalo sports history when he was playing here.
I've talked to some of the veteran writers over the years about OJ's era, which I was just in high school and college then.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a reporter named Chuck Pollock who worked at the Olean Times-Herald for years. He's now retired, but doing some freelance work in the Southern Tier, but he covered those teams. And he points out that when he covered the Bills in the mid-70s, nobody knew who he was. I mean, this is the Olean Times-Herald, O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson treated him as well as a guy from the New York Times or the networks. He said he couldn't have been nicer under any circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And he's always remembered that. And that's why when O.J. had his issues and problems in 1994, et cetera, that, he really took it hard, because this was a guy that, he looked up to just from a personal standpoint, and others had the same reaction.
Yeah, it's interesting, because during that time when the troubles were starting, I was working for Hertz Rent-A-Car. And of course, that was when he was running through airports, and I never got a chance to meet him, but he came into Chicago quite often. And anybody who had ever met him, they would always send, usually one of our dispatcher would go and pick him up at the airport. And most of the time when he would come back, though, he would just come back to the counter, take the bus back. And everybody always said, how gracious he was with everybody, and that he really did have, this kind of wonderful charisma about him. But yeah, that was really interesting, because he actually came to Chicago that day. He flew to Chicago. He was supposed to play in a golf tournament. And our city manager, I was working in the downtown office, he was so excited because he was going to play golf with O.J. Simpson. And then, needless to say, the golf game never happened. But
funny story about that. In 1993, the Bills had a 20-year reunion of the electric company, the offense from the Bills, that was called that because they turned down the juice. And OJ came up at halftime into the press box and was talking to a few people. And he was talking to Milt Northrup, who covered the Bills for quite a number of years for the Buffalo News. So I'm on the other side of Milt, and OJ's over there. And Milt goes, "Oh, I'd like you to meet Budd Bailey." And I stuck my hand out, and OJ's attention got diverted. And he turned around and started talking to the guy and walked away. And it's like, don't think I'm gonna shake his hand now.
Yeah.
He's gone and never came back. So that was the
Oh.
one chance I ever had to
Yeah.
at least shake his hand, and
Mhm.
it disappeared quickly.
Yeah.
My kid sat on his lap at Hyatt downtown,
Oh.
and those two boys played ball in many years hence.
Mhm.
And one was defensive player, section 6, so.
One time I was at the flea market antique store at Eastern Hills Mall, or Hanger's was, you might know it. And they have a little used book section, and there was a book there by a referee or linesman or whatever his job was in the NFL, written about 1982. And it's like, who is this? I've never heard of the guy. I opened it up, and it was O.J. Simpson's autograph inside.
Oh, for heaven's sakes.
And they were charging $5 for it. And I said, and I knew OJ's signature. I'd seen enough to know it was authentic. So I said, is a book autographed by OJ Simpson under any circumstances worth $5 to me? And it's like, yeah, I guess it is.
Yeah.
So in fact, I made a second trip back there, and it wasn't sold in the interim. It's like,
Mhm.
okay, I'm sold.
That's great.
So it's on my bookshelf, and what I do with it, I don't know.
Jim Kelly, I was at a Wild Turkey Federation dinner, and my cousin asked him, which played ball again. He said, the price was right, it would. Then he said, oh no, these guys are too big now. Kind of interesting.
Yeah, there's just so many, there's endless, these wonderful stories, of the history and how everybody remembers it. Anyone else have any questions or want to share any fun stories or anything? Anybody online?
Yeah, if you're online, you can unmute and ask your question. I'll pull you up on screen. PowerPoint up right now.
By the way, if you look at the cover, you'll notice number 32 is missing.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That is not a mistake.
Mhm.
How did you pick the cover?
Well, we came up with several names to Photoshop the stars of the team, and OJ was originally on the list, and they stuck with the guys from the 90s and now, which probably not a bad marketing decision.
Mhm.
Well, no, it's all about money. I give talks to local senior centers with Stu Boyer from Channel 2.
Isn't 34 the old Cookie Gilchrist number?
Yeah. But that's not him. So Stu Boyer and I get up and we say, we're here for an hour and a half. If you have any questions in sports, we're here to answer them. And most of the answers will be generally off the record. So we can tell a few stories that you wouldn't see in print. We might leave out a name or two. So I said, but one thing you should know, of all the questions about sports, 2/3 of the answer is money.
Yeah.
Why are things like this? Money.
Sure.
Yeah, well, I worked for Hertz for 17 years, so I kind of went through the whole, because I stayed a Bills fan. I was never a Chicago Bears fan. It just never did anything to me. But it was funny because I used to rent to Marv Levy. I
Okay.
rented to him like 3 times, and he was just the most gracious, nicest man. Because I mean, we would, of course, I tell everybody, okay, clear the decks. Mary's going to take care of him when he walks up to the counter. And of course, I'd always upgrade him into the nicest car I could. And I just say, I'm going to give you, it was the years of the Tempos and the Tauruses. And he'd be booked like a mid-sized Tempo. And then I'd always say, I'm going to give you a Taurus or a Thunderbird or something. He'd be always like, oh, well, that's very nice of you. Thank you. But I just always remember what a nice person he was. And he was such a pleasure. Another one too was Steve Tasker. And it was funny because when he came up to the counter and I ran into him and he left. And I said, he said he plays for the Buffalo Bills. And the girl at the counter says, he doesn't look like a football player. He's too short. Because I mean, he was barely
Like 5'9",
he was barely taller than me, only an inch taller than I was, But again, he was also just very, very, very nice.
You made me think of one obscure story that went into the book. When we were coming up with a list, I said to Greg, there's one thing we have to include. What's that? Marv Levy's fight song.
Yes.
And for those of you who don't know, Marv one time said to the team, if you guys beat Miami on Sunday, I'll write a fight song for the team. So they beat them, and I don't know if Marv did any work, but Marv had a coaches show on the Empire Sports Network. And so the show begins, and he announces like 20 minutes into the show that he had made that promise, and he's written the song, and he bursts into song. And the idea of Marv Levy singing on regional television is obviously a silly one, and the tape has been preserved. But the best part for me is one of the media guests to talk to Marv during that show was a guy named Jimmy Golan. Now, Jimmy was working for the Associated Press, and he still is in Boston. And he was a philosophy major at Harvard. So, which makes him more than qualified, I think, to try to figure out an NFL locker room, which he did for the Bills and all that. And so Jimmy's sitting in the background while Marv is singing, looking like, how did this happen? What am I doing here with Marv Levy singing in front of me? But I said, this has got to be included. And I urge people to go to YouTube immediately and look it up just for the comic value of it. But only Marv would do that.
Yeah, I haven't seen that yet. I have to do.
Go find it tonight.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah.
I played it for a friend. I showed it to a friend of mine, and we went out to Denver the next week and visited an old Bills fan who I went to high school with. And I was trying to describe it, and he was kind of getting the idea. And then the NFL Today on CBS showed the fight song. And Glenn is watching it and he says, "You didn't tell me it was the funniest moment in television history."
Oh, that's great. Yeah, one of the video clips that I'll never forget is it was, and I don't even know what game it was, but I just remember it was Jim Kelly was the quarterback, and they had a late hit on him, and I don't even know who the referee was, got up, and he just could not think of how to describe it. And he says, we have, a penalty, against the defense. And he says, personal foul. The player had the quarterback down and given him the business.
Yep.
Do you
That's
remember
pretty
that
famous.
one?
Yep.
That one, I showed it. A friend of mine is a huge sports fan of every team, and I was telling him about it, and he immediately went on YouTube so he could see it. He's like, "Oh my God, that's so cool!" But yeah.
And we talked about Buffalo being a small town by NFL standards, and I remember when Jim Kelly was signed, and the Bills had been awful from 1983 to 85, and they had about 8 different quarterbacks, from Bruce Matheson to Vince Ferragamo to Joe Dufek, all forgettable in a Buffalo uniform. And Kelly was signed, and it was a friend of mine from high school was living in Connecticut, and he picks up the USA Today and reads the story about Kelly's signing with the Bills. And there's a quote that says, "It's almost like Christmas in August," said Dave Hormel of Clarence. And Dave was a classmate of Kevin and mine.
Oh my gosh.
So, and Dave was he was like the sergeant at arms of the Booster Club, which I don't know how rowdy those meetings get. I guess they needed a sergeant at arms. But to see a classmate from Buffalo, it was just such a typical Buffalo moment to read him in USA Today describing that particular event.
That's great. Yeah. There's just so many. Anyone else have any questions or, have comments about anything?
What other, you said you wrote 15 books. What other kind of books have you written? Are they all sports?
No. I'll see if I can give you the condensed story. 9 of them are books for school kids.
Oh, okay.
A friend of mine at the Buffalo News retired from that spot and worked for a publisher called Cavendish Square, which does school books for kids. So the first book they were going to do a series of 6 books on athletes designed for junior high kids, middle school, that shows my age. And so I wrote a short biography of Jackie Robinson. It's probably like 25,000 words. So that went well. I knew Jackie Robinson really well. The next book was civil rights leaders. So I wrote a biography of Booker T. Washington. So I wound up doing 9 of those. And The one that was the most memorable for maybe the wrong reasons was there was an assignment on European history and I had my choice. And the only one that sounded remotely interesting to me, and that might be a stretch, was Soviet geography. I don't want to say that's a dry subject, but there was dust on the keyboard whenever I'd work on it. And I mean, I learned a bit about Soviet geography and resources or whatever, but let's just say there was not a stampede to take that one out of the nation's libraries, I'm sure. But it was an easy project. It was fun. I did like biography. I wrote a biography of Ichiro, the baseball player. I did Brown versus Board of Education. I did the Transcontinental Railroad, several things that learned a lot on the way. And again, you're writing for 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th graders. So I had to keep it simple. So I didn't have to get that deep into the subject. So someone like me could write it. So I did several of those and we got to the pandemic and suddenly there was no reason to publish school books because nobody was going to school. So they stopped assigning those. And when the pandemic ended, more or less, I've never been able to get back on their good graces and lists. So that dried out, but it was a nice little fun project just to do on the side. The other books, I did a history of the Sabres when I worked in 1989. First 20 years of the team, called Celebrate the Tradition, which got to talk to everybody from Scotty Bowman to Don Luce and Craig Ramsey and say, well, what the heck happened? And one of my copy editors, honestly, was Seymour Knox III, the owner of the team. Since I was working for the Sabres then, he read it over and made corrections, and he made some good finds. He's a pretty good copy editor for, multimillionaire it goes. Usually you hire somebody to look at that stuff, but he read it personally. And both Seymour and Nordy talked about it. So that was a lot of fun. I did a autobiography with Rob Ray in 2007. And I try to tell Rob that I made him what he is today, which is a TV commentator and commercial spokesman or whatever. And I don't think he's buying it, but Rob was it was an interesting experience writing for it. And he's still a friend and he's obviously done well. I did 2 books. The third book I did was this one, Today in Buffalo Sports History. That started when the sports editor of the Buffalo News came over to me one time and said, is there anything you could do in which we could write something every day? And I said, well, I've been fooling around with a list of daily events on the computer and saving them to see if I could do it. And I've got the easy ones are all done, but I got about 70 dates I'd have to work with. So I wound up filling out the list and doing one highlight a day, about 5 paragraphs, and we put it in the paper. And the response was terrific. People were saying, "Oh my goodness, I remember that game. Let me tell you my memories of it." And people just loved it. And after a while, I said, "Well, this has got to be a book." And it was easy to figure out other things that went on that day. So that came out, and then I had so much fun writing this that when the pandemic started, I said, well, what's the most fun I had doing a book? And I said, well, Buffalo sports history on a daily basis. So I said, okay, what if I could write something for Cleveland? And a friend of mine was the sports editor in Akron, and he was in the same boat and said, let's write a book. So we did the daily sports in Cleveland. So plus the Braves book, which came out around the same time the Bills book. So add those all up, and I guess you get pretty close to 15.
So we have a comment from someone on Zoom. Mary Cochran wants to talk to you about your writing and working at the Buffalo News.
Okay. I was described on my retirement as either a Willie Mays a 5-tool player, which in baseball was hit, run, throw, hit for power, field, or a utility man, because I did so many different things in 23 years. I covered the Sabres. I wrote a running column. I covered the Bandits. I worked in various positions in the office, whether it was reading stories or picking out stories or rewriting things that came in from high school. So over the last couple of years, I covered high school. So I wore a ton of hats, and it's funny now to look back on it, because when I started at the Buffalo News in 1994, I think, there were 24 people on the sports staff. There's now 8. And with the deadlines, with the paper being printed in Cleveland and shipped every day through the snow in the winter, of course, if it gets there, you pick up the morning paper and there's nothing that's happened after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It's almost hurts to see it, how the situation has changed so much, but that's the way the business goes. And but I'm enough of a traditionalist, meaning old guy, that says, gee, I kind of like things the way they were when I could get up in the morning and pull the paper out and read about the Sabres game from the night before. But those days are gone, and it's too bad in many ways.
Warren Buffett still owns the.
No,
He sold it.
he sold it when the selling was good.
Oh.
And when I arrived, Warren Buffett was making $1 million a week on the Buffalo News. And that had slowly come down over the years, but he sold to a chain called Lee Enterprises for however many millions it was, but it wasn't like it was at its peak. And Lee has done a lot of cost cutting. Much of the copy editing and layout is done out of state, all electronically. And so, as somebody said, people would look at the paper in Columbus, Ohio, trying to edit, and if somebody typed up Budd Bailey as the mayor of Buffalo instead of Byron Brown, a guy in Columbus isn't going to know. So the number of mistakes certainly has gone up. But that said, where anybody's in the business knows the value of and I'm not running for mayor, by the way. Don't keep my hat out of that ring. But we're not. I'm certainly sold on the importance of local journalism, but it's just tough when you're shorthanded. I think we were well over 100 staff members in the newsroom when I was there, and I think it's under 50 now.
Wow.
And a lot of institutional knowledge has walked out the door. And I think one of the reasons that I did all right at the Buffalo News was having grown up here. I moved here in 1970 when I was a sophomore in high school. And not only could I spell Skajakwita most of the time, but I knew Bill's history. I was around when the Sabres started. I was here when the Braves started. And that's an advantage as opposed to anybody coming in and has to learn that. So just that gave me a leg up on a lot of the people that theoretically were just as qualified, but I had that one advantage.
Our other Zoom Sherry shared a link
There we are.
Oh, gosh.
Let me see if I can get our Zoom guests to see this as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, Marv Levy. I'm gonna tell you what, this thing is better than Shout.
Might have to go back a bit.
Jimmy, what do you think? Now, this is good, but it's not better than all these other.
Yes, they hand out lyrics to the audience.
If he's singing, maybe I'll start it from the beginning. There it is.
Practicing before, but for the viewing audience, Saturday night before the Miami game, when we met with our team, I made a very.
You can only see Jimmy Jimmy is on the very edge of it. You can only see half of him.
Miami Dolphins. I'd write them personally a fight song, a Buffalo Bills fight song for our players and our fans. Well, we won the game, as you know. Today at the team meeting, they held me to it. I was prepared. We wrote a fight song, and these great people here in the audience right now, who've done a little practicing with me, are going to help me sing it for all of you and the Buffalo Bills fans. Y'all ready out here? All right. Okay. Here we go, folks. Go Bills, for we are here to cheer for you. Go Bills, we are your fans so true. With victory in sight, we'll yell with all our might. So go Bills, fight Bills, go. Come on, let's win for Buffalo. Go Bills, we're with you, fight Bills. we're with you. Go Bills, let's win this game. We'll raise them all our voices high. A Bills team spirit will not die. So go Bills, fight Bills, go. Come on, let's win for Buffalo. Go Bills, for we are here to cheer for you. Go Bills, we are your fans so true. With victory in sight, we'll yell with all our might. Go Bills, fight Bills, go. Come on, let's win for Buffalo.
I love it. I just love it. That is great. That is great. They need to revive that.
I think Empire found a band and they recorded background music to it and put it together with the video.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, you remember the one, the Sabres, when they were in the Stanley Cup.
We're gonna win that cup
Yeah.
by Donna McDaniel.
Yeah, Donna McDaniel.
And why that stays in my mind, and I can't
Yes.
remember the car keys is a whole nother argument.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. You remember things like that.
A friend of mine said he used to work at Grant's during the 74-75 season when that song was popular. And he'd be sitting there working and suddenly, we're gonna win that cup. And it burst in his head and he couldn't get out. It was like burned a wormhole in him. It's like anything but this.
Yeah. I still remember it. I do. It's funny because I actually had the 45 because I had just gotten back from Italy. I was studying in Siena and I had just gotten back when the playoffs had started. I remember that. I was just like crazy. It was great. No, it's great. You know, really, again, you know, all of this is what makes Buffalo such a great place to live because I think so much of this, you know, brings people together. And, you know, it's like, and you know, I grew up here, but I lived in Chicago for a number of years. I also lived in LA, you know, and just, I've never seen a city, you know, I mean, Chicago fans are really, you know, they're pretty avid, but like in LA, it's a whole nother planet over there, I guess, what I want to say, but yeah, there's so many, you know, wonderful memories, I think that a lot of people have, you know, surrounding Buffalo Bills. Anybody else have anything that they want to add or talk about?
Each one of your books are very narrow. Football, baseball. Have you ever thought of doing a community sporting book?
Well, that's what this is, basically.
Well,
That covers everything.
I mean, covering like, you know, I think
Golf.
bandits of Ray.
Golf, everything, yeah. That was kind of the idea that everything could get a moment or two.
Okay.
You know, so if,
I mean, like-
Lancey Smith won an US amateur golf tournament or something, it goes in there. That was actually fun to make sure we touched on everything.
Yeah, because Buff State football.
Marathon running, you know, Buffs, all the colleges, and stuff. That one thing that I hadn't realized, and I'm not sure if it made the book. It might have made it at the last minute. Was St. Bonaventure had a 99 game home winning streak that was snapped by Niagara in 1961. St. Bonaventure used to play in the Armory in Olean. And I believe it was about as big as this room for basketball. If they could get about 12 fans who were sitting on the shelves looking down on it, was as tough a place to play as you could imagine. And they had won 99 games in a row in there, and Niagara came in and beat them. And probably as a result, St. Bonaventure decided to build its own arena on campus, just so it wouldn't have to go through that again, and actually have people that could get into the building.
So do you have another project that you're starting on now, or?
I'm looking at a couple things, but nothing too serious quite yet. We'll see.
Okay.
But I think it's fair to say I'm done with the Braves. I think that'll be my last word on the subject.
Oh, okay.
But and certainly the Sabres. This is not the time I really would want to sell a book on the Sabres.
Yeah, maybe.
They've fallen on hard times, and thank goodness the Jets have a longer playoff drought than the Sabres
Right,
do.
yeah.
So whenever that fact comes up on the TV screen about the longest wait for the playoffs, the Jets are half a season
Yeah.
longer. But it hasn't been, the Sabres are certainly trying hard.
Yeah, they're trying, but that's what happens. But, we'll still cheer for them. We'll still be behind them. It doesn't really matter.
And I think it's interesting that the Bills and Sabres are owned by the same guy. And one of them took a while, but has found consistent success. and the other one hasn't. And one of my lessons, I worked for the Sabres for 6 years in public relations, and one of the things I learned was that teams lose for a reason in pro sports. And the reason for the Sabres was they were content with mediocrity. And as long as the stands were mostly full and they were paying their bills, they were okay. But they didn't really want to go that extra mile. And I remember in 1990, the Sabres had a chance to acquire a hockey player named Peter Stastny. He was in the Hall of Fame from Quebec, who was getting near the end of his career, but the Sabres were in contention for the number 1 overall spot that year. They finished number 2. And Stastny was available, and they had a trade to get the 2 of the Stastny brothers Quebec for some prospects. And it really would have been a win now sort of thing. It's like, hey, we've got a chance to march through the opening here. And the ownership vetoed it because it was too expensive. And the Sabres got knocked out in the first round, and they've come close at other times, as we know, in 99 and in the mid 2000s, but they were never willing to go that extra step and come up with the money for whatever reason, whether they just didn't have the resources handy or what. But now it's hard to know. It's hard to believe the same guy is running the Bills and the Sabres in the same way, Mike, because Terry is so much more of a hockey fan than a football fan. You just wonder if he's interfering a little more in hockey, whereas in football, he knows what he doesn't know and just says, all right, I hired 2 guys. It took me a while, but I hired the right 2 guys and Bean and McDermott. And these are the guys that know what they're doing. And now that they're winning, I'm not going to go near them. I want to keep up with it, obviously, because I own the team, but the Sabres seem to be adrift again. And it's kind of puzzling how it's all worked out. And I'm sure Terry's the first one to tell you how upset he is, because, he used to drive from northwestern Pennsylvania to games because he had season tickets back in the day. So it's a puzzling situation.
Did you written in your books about Muckler, Ted, and
that has come up, and mostly in the Rob Ray book, because he was in the middle of it.
Right.
And I was covering the team for the Buffalo News that year, and I think Derek Plant summed it up nicely. And Derek's a great guy. He said, usually I have to turn on the television to turn on my favorite soap operas, but now all I have to do is go in the locker room.
Sabres like
it was just an unbelievable mess. Everybody hated everybody and was taking sides, and it was just chaotic, and you knew it had to explode. And yet, Ted Nolan was a good enough coach and hit the right buttons and somehow got that team into the second round of the playoffs. And the more I look back on that, the more I shake my head and said, did that really happen? It's like, yeah, that did. And
he was coach of the year.
Yeah.
Muckler was
GM of the year.
And
funny
both got fired.
Funny story about that. I was writing for the Sporting News on the summer during that year. And the playoffs ended like over the weekend, and Muckler was fired, I think, on a Tuesday. And I talked to Larry Wiggy, who was the hockey editor of the Sporting News, a couple days after that. And he said, it's funny, I called up John Monday night and told him he had been named the executive of the year for the NHL by the Sporting News, and I wanted a little reaction. And he seemed distracted and not thrilled and barely talked to me, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And then the next morning they announced he'd been fired.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, now I know what the problem was. But I can't blame the Sabres. That was such a bizarre situation all the way around. And getting Regier and Ruffin was probably the best long-term answer they could think of. And obviously the team did pretty well the next couple of years until John Regas took over and guided the team into bankruptcy, which is a whole nother chapter of the Sabres' life. But just going around, and I remember waiting to get in a hotel space, and Ted Nolan was sitting there, and he saw John Muckler and a couple of the other hockey department executives having dinner, and Nolan looked at the guys that he was with and he goes, "Let's get out of here." And they left the restaurant. So the infighting was just incredible, but Nolan was really good at saying, forget about Nolan. Muckler and me are a different story. You worry about winning. And that team overachieved like no other team I can remember. I mean, their leading scorer was Derek Plant. One of their leading goal scorers was Jason Daw. They had a great goalie and a cast of unknowns. And Dominic was a little odd. I'm not gonna deny that. One time on team plane that I was on, a charter, one of the players came back to the front of the plane and he's wearing a spaghetti dinner. It's like, well, what happened? Dominic lost to me in cards and flipped the spaghetti on my lap. Oh, okay. That's interesting. Not that I could write about it at the time, but.
No.
So it was quite a year, and Jim Kelly and I, shook our heads on what had gone on that whole year for quite a while. The late Jim Kelly, not the other Jim Kelly.
Yeah.
Not the quarterback, not the Volkswagen dealer, the hockey writer.
Now, we have people here and also on Zoom. Where can they get your books?
The Bills book right now is just about sold out. I went to Barnes and Noble personally in the last week and did not see a copy out there. So you might want to call around to the local bookstores and see if they have any. Obviously, if you go to Reedy Press, the publisher, that company might have some. Amazon usually orders a bunch of them, and it's probably okay there, so that's fine. The Braves book is published by St. Johann Press. I would think they have some. We had some technical troubles with the book, but Barnes and Noble in Clarence has several autographed copies in the local section that they'd be more than happy to sell you, just so they don't have to look at it anymore, and our autographs. But seriously, production was a real problem. It's a very small publisher and had some major difficulties along the way. But the people that have actually gotten a copy and read it and have really loved the Braves book. What we did there was we had first started writing long 3,000-word biographies of all the players that performed for the Braves, and that were 71 players. The problem was nobody wanted to read 210,000 words on a basketball team that had folded 45 years ago. So we shrunk all but 12 down to about 500 words, and we kept the long biographies of the major stars and threw in some team history, and it covers the team things really well. We got a lot of stories that haven't seen the light of day in years, if at all, and so forth. And the people that have actually got it or big phrase fans just seem to love it. So that's been very gratifying. The production stuff is out of my hands, but I think it's the last word on the Braves, and it's going to be the last word because nobody else is going to care enough to write a book like that from this point on.
I used to work for Paul Snyder, and this was in the 90s, and he would get constant calls from John Y. Brown, and he would never take them. I'm not here, I'm not here, I'm not here. But he also used to get constant calls from Ernie DiGregorio, who at the time was a greeter in a casino
Yes.
in, I believe it was Detroit. And
Connecticut.
And anyways,
Yeah.
Snyder was on a consulting contract at Casino Niagara, and they would talk for ages, talking back and forth. And also, Ernie D had taken his pay over a 25-year deferred
Right.
system, so he used to also call to check in on his checks.
Yeah, I think he got $50,000 a year for 20 or 25 years.
Yeah.
He had deferred it. He was like one of the highest paid players in the league coming out of college. Paul Snyder actually bought 6 copies of the book. His family came. We had a
He didn't.
book launch.
His family.
His book launch.
He was always trying to buy pennants too.
And Paul, a relative said, "Oh, Paul loves the book. We're getting 6 for everybody and all that." Ernie D came to that session, and before it started, Ernie was in one of the offices in the front. So I went up and introduced myself, and it's hard to tell people now how popular Ernie D was at that point when the Braves drafted him, but he was like a phenomenon because he's little kid, 6 foot, looks about 5'8", looks like Don D or something like that. And
Dunk the ball.
just move the ball like magic.
Yeah.
And took Providence to the Final Four where Marvin Barnes suffered a knee injury and Providence lost. So, but Providence just fell in love with Ernie. So I exchanged the usual chatter with Ernie and I said, Ernie, can you buy an adult beverage in the city limits of Providence even today? And he paused and he said, I can now, but back in the day. That makes sense.
He did look like a little kid.
He did. But when Ernie was there for the launch party, someone asked him a rather complicated question about the Spirits of St. Louis, which got a share of the TV dollars when the merger took place, rather than getting a team in the new league, which made them hundreds of millions of dollars. But it's a little complex. So someone asked Ernie about that deal, and Ernie goes, that's kind of tough. Bud, why don't you take that one? And I'm saying to myself, Ernie, you're still the point guard. You're still passing the ball where it needs to go. Some things never change.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great story.
But Ernie was delightful, and Buffalo is his second favorite city, and I think he still comes back every so often, if only to get free good Italian meals here. Not that they don't have them in Providence, because they obviously do.
Anything else? Anybody else have anything they
Any more
want to add?
questions?
Anything else? Yeah.
I'm that brilliant, huh?
Well, it's funny because as I hear you talking, it sparks stories, from me too. And I do have a fairly short one that I'd like to tell, because I use this on my tours too, when I talk about the Buffalo Sabres. This was around 2008, 2009, I decided to do a train trip by myself through Europe. And I was going from Venice to Salzburg. And on my way, I was supposed to stop in Villach, Austria, and change trains. Well, I got there, and because we were late, I misconnected. Now, Villach, Austria is just this little tiny border town. Actually, Wolfgang Puck is from there, which I found out later. But, what are you going to do when you get 2 hours for the next train? Of course, you go to the bar. And I met a gentleman in there who spoke English very well. Most of them didn't. And, we got to talking, and he asked me where I was from. And I said, well, usually when I'd say in towns like that, you say Buffalo, they have absolutely no idea where it is. So I would just say, well, I'm from New York State, which is, and then, New York City. Well, no, we're on the other side of the state. And he says, he goes, well, but where, what town? And I said, well, it's a city, it's called Buffalo. Buffalo Sabres. I'm like, what? And he's like, oh. He goes, they were my favorite team. He said, when I was a little boy, and that's when they were in the Stanley Cup. He says, we used to watch the games here all the time. And he lists the entire lineup of the Buffalo Sabres team. He's listing, Dave Dryden, the French Connection, he even knew that. But it was just so funny to be, 3,000 miles away in this little town in the middle of Austria. And yet here, the Buffalo Sabres, this kid was this huge fan of the Sabres. And that was it was something that was a wonderful travel moment that I had. I think that day we had such a good time.
Around 1989, I was working in the Sabres Public Relations Department, and the mail is always full of interesting things. And there was a letter addressed to the PR department from a guy in the Soviet Union. Sounded like 20s or 30s or whatever, and wrote and said, in somewhat English and understandable enough, I'm a big fan of the Sabres. Do you have anything, you could send me about the team? The Sabres were popular in Russia then because they beat the Soviet teams in the 1976 and 1981 special tour, 1980 tours. They beat the wings of the Soviet in 76, and they beat the Red Army team in 80. Two of the highlights of Sabre history, of course, at the time, because, you didn't see Soviet teams and players weren't allowed to come over. So so I sent a bunch of programs and old yearbook over to him and got a response a year later, and I could hit the first time the guy wrote, it took like 6 months for the package to get from the Soviet Union here. Well, in the interim, it turned into Russia from the Soviet Union, whatever the timing was. And suddenly it took like 3 weeks to get the thing over there. And he sent me all sorts of Soviet hockey stuff and Russian hockey stuff, some of which I still have. I've still got a book on that's like a picture book on great hockey players, most of them Soviets, but from like Wayne Gretzky's included and not just the obvious candidates from thing. And it was just fascinating to see how things changed. And he kept writing every year. And after I left, my replacement at the Sabres came up to me and said, who's this guy Anatoly that says he gets stuff from you guys all the time? It's like, we're old pals. Send him whatever you can spare.
Oh, that's great.
So he did.
Did they ever mention McGillney?
That was part of why he was popular. Yeah. That was an interesting episode to be in, because I was working for the team when he defected. And I was in Philadelphia, helping out the NHL with public relations for the conference finals. And suddenly it's like, who's coming over here? Who's signing with the Sabres? Huh? But I couldn't do anything in Philadelphia. Obviously, they ran everything from Buffalo. But it was really that was an odd moment. And Alex was such an odd personality and had so much stuff going on. I mean, he probably figuring wake up and be looking at a firing squad any night in his life from a KGB squad to wipe him out or something. That I can't imagine how much guts it took to do that.
Really?
And I've talked a little bit to Jerry Meehan and Don Luce about what that whole experience was like.
Mm-hmm.
And they were in Stockholm and they were driving from hotel to hotel, trying to stay ahead of everybody and get them on the plane and calling George Bush or, making calls, see what Bush could do on that level to make sure he could defect and all that. It was just an amazing time. It's cloak and dagger stuff.
What a story. Yeah.
Then he decided not to fly in airplanes.
Yeah, that was a PR nightmare. Yeah,
It seemed good on the rink ahead of everyone.
Suddenly he decided he was afraid to fly, so he took a limousine to a game in St. Louis.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm in the PR department and somebody goes, oh, well, Alex is driving to St. Louis for the game. He's what? Excuse me? Driving? St. Louis isn't exactly Pittsburgh.
Yeah, that's like, it would have been far from Chicago, that's from Buffalo. That's all.
Jerry Meehan's secretary tells the story about how Alex was sitting next to him, waiting to go in to talk to Jerry as best he could. And Alex was like saying he didn't know English or something. And Debbie was on the phone talking with a friend and cracked a joke and looked over and Alex was laughing.
Yeah.
Like, okay, I bet you Alex knows a little more than he's letting on here.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Anyone have anything else? Anything from our Zoom people?
If you have any questions, you can use the chat or unmute.
One of the funny things about working for a professional sports team is you get to know the people who in some cases were your boyhood heroes. And my prime example with that is Don Luce. And this is a guy who was a standout with the Sabres when I was in high school, of course, and college in the 70s. And he was working as an assistant general manager and head of scouting. And I was on a couple of slow pitch softball teams. And you're always looking for bodies in that back in the day. And Don says, hey, you got room for a couple players? Well, who? My son and I. Sure. And I'm like, Don Luce and I on the same team? What's wrong with this picture? So one time, Don plays first base. His son Scott, who went in an NHL career in the front office with Las Vegas and a few other teams, done very well. Don's at first base and my friend is coaching first. A member of my team is on first, and he hears two guys on the bench talking. Goes, boy, it's funny how your eyes go or something at this age, but I could swear that first baseman looks a lot like Don Luce, but what would he be doing here? And Glenn goes to him, actually, it is Don Luce. He's friends with our pitcher. Oh. So Don practically had to sign autographs once the game was over.
Right. Oh, that's great.
And I mean, Craig Ramsey was the same way. Craig's wife used to tell a story that Craig is considered the nicest guy that ever lived by anyone that's ever met him. Just a lovely fellow, as the British would say. And one time, an organization called him up, might have been, say it was the SPCA, called him up and called the family up, and his wife Susan answers the phone. Susan, Craig, it's the SPCA. Okay. What do they want? They want to know if you want to do a commercial for them. Do they know my motto is the only good dog is a dead dog?
Whoa.
Craig, they still want you to do the commercial. Okay.
Actually, I kind of remember hearing that. When you said that, it kind of struck something, but.
And, I mean, Derek Plant was in town for the 50th anniversary, and I said, I interviewed him about the goal he scored. He scored the only game-winning goal for the Sabres in a Game 7, the overtime goal against Quebec in '97. And, asked him about that and the memories in his career and what he was doing. I said, finally, I have to ask you about your dog, T. And he goes, yeah, that dog was more popular than me. We'd go into a mall or something, and everybody would go around the dog and start petting him and talking, and everyone's like, talk to me here.
Oh, gosh. Oh, that's great. All right. Well, anybody have any other questions or any other comments?
Well,
No.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for
being
having
here.
me.
This was fabulous. Our next book club is February 6th, where we will have author J.R. Krull talking about his book, Single Wing, A Story of Boyhood, Friendship, and Football. So another football book to begin the year.
And he has some books, Bud's got some books up here if any of you are interested in purchasing them tonight
At a discount.
at a discount.
And
What about
autographed.
What's the
And
smaller book?
autographed.
Yeah, what's the smaller book?
Great.
Pardon me?
The smaller book, what's the